Okay, welcome to part 12. As I said in the previous part, what we're going to be doing in this part is creating the page to view the private message. So at the moment what we have is a way for the user to delete their messages, but not to actually view them. To test this, obviously we're going to need some messages, so I've forgotten who I'm logged in as, but I'm just going to send some messages to myself. So me, and the subject can just be 1, and then I'll do, I don't know, I'll think of something clever for the next one. So this can just be 2, which will say 3. Whoa, crazy. Okay, so there we go. I'll just go back to my inbox. These are unread. Oh, sorry. Okay, that's something I forgot to mention at the end of last part. These two conversations, okay, so let me explain by going back to the code. If we go to our add conversations function, or create conversation, here, where we just simply added the user ID to the array of user IDs to insert, we then set the last read time for them equal to 0, which is not what we want to do. We want to set it equal to the current time. So actually the best way to do that is most likely just to use this as the default value in the array. So we're going to remove this and put that there, except instead of for time, we're going to have the Unix timestamp, i.e. now, like so. And also this user ID needs to be the session user ID. So sorry for being a total pro as usual. Okay, there we go. Nope. There we go. So now what we're doing, instead of the previous method, we are using this whole string as a default value, and then for every other user, we're setting their time to 0 in this loop, and then we're imploding all of that here. So it's essentially the same, except completely different. But anyway, yeah, that's just something I meant to mention almost after I'd said it, but then didn't ever. Okay, so that's that done. So let's go ahead and create the view conversation page. So the first thing we're going to do is add a link here, because if you remember we left this blank as a sort of placeholder. What we want to do is have this link to the correct page, which is fairly obvious. So what we want to link to is index.php and page equals view conversation, I think. And we also need to specify the conversation ID, so that the view conversation page knows which conversation data to load. So we're going to specify another variable called conversation ID, and that's going to be equal to some PHP, which is just going to be outputting the conversation ID. So actually, I'm just going to copy this from above because I know this works. It's a pretty simple thing to do, but I don't want to make any more typos. So yeah. Anyway, so what we need to do now is just make sure this links to the right place. So let's go back here, just reload this, click on one of these, you can see we get this blank page, and in the URL we have conversation ID equals 3, so that's good. So what we can do now is go to our code again and go to the view conversation page file, which again, if you remember, is in the core folder and then the pages folder. So in this file what we need to do is two things. One of them is show all of the messages, which is what we're going to do first, and the other thing is we need to provide a form for the user to add their own messages. Before we do any of that, what I'm going to do is add a div at the top called actions, which is going to specify, well, it's just going to contain two useful-ish links. The first one is going to be a link to the inbox page, so it's a link to index.php page equals inbox, and this is just going to say inbox. And the second one is going to be a logout link, because that might be useful. So index.php page equals logout, and that's just going to say logout. Okay, so that's just two little links that will probably be useful later on. So next thing we need to do is essentially the same as we did for the conversations page, except for the messages. So we're going to create a div which is going to contain all of the messages. Its class is going to be messages, and inside it we're going to have a PHP loop which is going to loop over all of the messages. So we can have a PHP block in here which is going to be for each messages as message, show the messages. Obviously we don't want to I'm not sure what I'm saying. At the top of the page we then need to get the list of conversations, the list of messages that are in this conversation. So what I'm going to do is, well, first thing we need to do is check to make sure that this is actually a valid conversation. And we're only going to show the messages or fetch the messages if this is a valid conversation. So essentially what we need to do is make sure that the user is a member of this conversation so that they can't go around reading other people's messages. So anyway, at the top I'm going to add a PHP block with the right symbol, and we're going to do a simple check. So we're going to do if is set get conversation ID, so if they've specified a conversation ID, and validate conversation ID using this same variable, so get conversation ID, and just remember that this is the same function we created when doing the validation for the message deleting. So if this condition is true, it means that the conversation is valid. So inside of here we know that it's a valid conversation. However, we're not going to do this check like this because we need to know if this is a valid conversation in quite a few places, and we don't want to keep doing the same query twice because that'd be pretty stupid. So we're going to delete this and set the result of this equal to a variable. So we're going to do valid conversation equals. So that's something you can do. You can set a sort of if statement, but without the if part, i.e. a Boolean check, equal to a variable, and you can later use that in other if statements. So we're going to need this twice in total for this page, but as always we don't want to perform any more queries than are absolutely necessary. So yeah, that's that. So above this we're going to define an errors array. So the same as before, we always need the errors array. Actually, I believe that might be something I forgot. Yes, that is something I forgot. If you recall when we were creating this portion of the code here on the inbox page, I said that we needed to define the errors array outside of this if statement below, because we were also going to check to see if the user was a member of the conversation. No, sorry, we were also going to check to see if the user actually had conversations. If they didn't, we were going to show an error message. So we actually need to do that check. So just underneath here we can do a simple if empty conversations, because we obviously need to get the list of conversations first. Also, something that I probably should have pointed out at the time is that this fetch conversation summary has to be done after the conversation is deleted. Otherwise you'll delete a conversation and it'll still appear until next time you reload the page. But anyway, it's not something you need to worry about massively at the moment. So anyway, I'm just going to add something to this errors array, which is going to be a string, which is going to say you have no messages. And also we didn't actually ever display these messages, which is a bit of a silly thing to do again on my part, so sorry for that. But what we need to do is loop over the errors only if they're empty, although it doesn't make much difference because looping over an empty array effectively does nothing. But we're going to do it anyway, because it's just sort of what we do. So we're going to do if empty errors, then we're going to loop over the array, so for each errors as error, then we're going to output the div error message warning box thingy, who has the class which has the class of message and error, that's the red one, and it's going to contain the error, like so. So that's just something we forgot to do in the last part, and we can't really test this at the moment without deleting all my conversations, which isn't something we can do, but unless I forget, we'll test this a bit later on. So sorry for forgetting that, but well, I guess you noticed at the time anyway. It was a pretty daft thing just to forget to do, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. Anyway, so going back to what the actual subject of this part was supposed to be, which was the view conversation page, what we were doing was defining our errors array up here equal to be an array, and then we're going to perform a few checks below this, and then we are going to remember to output the error messages. So just below the validate or the valid conversation check, we're going to do simply if valid conversation, because we do need this at this point, it's just that we need it a bit later on as well. So if this is equal to false, we're going to set something into the errors array, or put something into the errors array, which is going to be the same message as before, invalid conversation ID. So not giving too much away, but enough to let them make them try a different ID, I guess, or a different link. Anyway, so that's that. And then in this bit here, we're going to have a few more error checks related to the submission of the form. And then here, we're going to check to see if the errors array is empty. And if it isn't, which is not what I did before, that should be false. Obviously, for very obvious reasons, but oh dear, not a good day today. Anyway, if anyone can work out my average errors per minute, don't tell me. It'd be an interesting stat, but don't tell me. Anyway, be depressing. Right, so here we need to do the same thing. So actually what I can do, for the sake of time saving, is just copy this, because we're using the same variable names, so you can just copy and paste that there, and it'll still work. Okay, so that's that done. And what we want to do now is only show the messages and the actions if this is a valid conversation. Because the only way that it won't be a valid conversation is if they're trying to mess with our system, basically, by trying different IDs and trying to read other people's messages and that sort of thing, and inputting invalid data. So what we're going to do is only show them this page, effectively, if the conversation is valid. So we're going to do another if check here. So if valid, valid conversation, we're going to do this block basically. And the reason, by the way, that we're not just using the errors array to determine this, which we could do, is that say if the user is on a valid page and they submit the form, we'd put something in the errors array, and then if we check if empty errors here, the whole form will disappear because the errors array won't be empty. But we do want to keep the form there, otherwise, because that'd just be really annoying if they have to like go back, click the message, type it all out again. So yeah, that's why we're doing that. Anyway, now we've determined that this is a valid conversation, what we need to do is actually get the data from it. So just inside this valid conversation block, what we're going to do is fetch the messages. So this is going to be creating a new function. I'm just going to sort of type it out for now, like I have been so far. So we're going to create a function called fetch conversation messages. We're going to give it a single parameter, which is going to be the conversation ID to get the messages for. So it's going to be get conversation ID. And we're going to store the result of this in a variable called messages. It's going to return an array. Okay, so let's just go to our backend file now, and we will code this function. So let's see, where's that? That's sorry, I'm being a bit blind. It's here. No, it isn't. It's here. Yes. Okay, good. So we're going to scroll up because fetching things come before other things. So under the previous fetch function, we are going to add a function, a new function called whatever I just called it, which was fetch conversation messages. Oops, and that's that highlight from before, which I'll just clear off screen. There we go. So fetch conversation messages, and we're passing in the conversation ID. And as usual, we just need to make sure that this conversation ID is suitable for use in a query. So we're going to cast it to an integer by doing this. Okay, that's that. And again, this SQL is fairly complicated, So I think what I'm going to do is call this here, and then in the next part we will go over the finishing off this function. So yeah, that's basically that. So thank you for watching, and come back for part 13, where we'll finish off this function and hopefully get time to test it all out.